For many individuals in this room, addressing climate change is a top priority. Should we fail to curb carbon emissions, hundreds of millions of people will lose their homes, lives, and livelihoods. Unfortunately, I won't be introducing a new device that sucks carbon out of the air and turns it into a Tesla, though I certainly hope Elon is working on that. Instead, I want to celebrate an underappreciated but fundamental tenet of the portfolio of climate solutions: divestment from fossil fuels. The proliferation of the fossil fuel divestment movement has meant that thousands of financial, academic, and religious institutions have pulled their investments in fossil fuel corporations, coal, oil, and gas, with many choosing to reinvest in green or sustainable energy. Johns Hopkins is among these institutions. In 2017, the Committee on Investments of the Board of Trustees chose to divest Hopkins' $4 billion endowment from thermal coal companies. It has now been 2.5 years since that divestment decision, and many more high-profile institutions have since divested their endowments from major companies with fossil fuel exposure. The fact is, it will take a diversified array of scientific, financial, and engineering innovations to be what many consider the culmination of humankind's complicated relationship with the environment since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. At Hopkins, along with thousands of universities, labs, and companies, many brilliant researchers have studied greenhouse gases, green energy technologies, and green energy systems. This research has helped us to create a clear path towards a decarbonized society. For now, the question remains, how do we get there? Fossil fuel divestment is one way to help. Divestment does not increase the efficiency of solar panels, though we do need solar panels to become more efficient. Divestment does not turn internal combustion engines into electric motors, though we need that too. Divestment does not even put fossil fuel companies out of business, nor is that what it aims to do. The truth is that if Hopkins pulled its investments in ExxonMobil tomorrow, it would barely register as a blip on their New York Stock Exchange ticker. So what does divestment accomplish? Divestment is an acknowledgement that we've built a society that is tremendously dependent on fossil fuels. Divestment is a first step in admitting that climate change is a crisis, and admitting that will allow us to make fundamental changes to our way of life and alter the way we think about energy. In a 2016 paper, Peter Sercombe-Bromley lays out a framework for the crucial energy transition that stewards of sustainability are asking for. He recounts the United States' response to the Pearl Harbor attacks in 1941 as they prepared to go to war. The emergency consolidated public and political will, he says. Manufacturers simply stopped what they were doing and focused on a new task. He argues that an epiphany on the order of Pearl Harbor may be necessary to spur the potential of energy innovation into mobilization. The potential of this energy innovation is great. As I mentioned before, many researchers have laid out the framework for the exact solutions required. Bromley suggests it is simply a matter of consolidating our public and political will. Now, this message seems particularly prescient when we think about our current situation. When a small SARS epidemic quickly exploded into a worldwide pandemic, it became a crisis. And when it became a crisis, governments coordinated on a massive scale to restructure entire economies to protect their citizens. Companies are retooling to help fight the coronavirus. What the coordinated effort shows is that when human lives are placed first, human lives are saved. Now, the bushfires that raged for months in Australia exemplify the type of transformational event that must take place for the crisis response necessary to stop climate change. However, the relatively rapid disengagement with the issue, even before COVID-19 became a worldwide reality, means it is unclear whether there will ever be a Pearl Harbor of climate change. Thus, the consolidation of public and political will must take place in a different manner. A CBS News poll from last September revealed that 64% of Americans polled regard climate change as a crisis. 56% believe it should be addressed right now, with another 13% believing it should be addressed in the next few years. Despite a coordinated disinformation campaign from the fossil fuel industry over the past 2 decades, Americans still believe in urgent climate action. So what gives? A story from last June is particularly illuminating. Pope Francis met with executives from BP, ExxonMobil, Shell, and others to declare a climate emergency. In response, the executives called on governments to put in place carbon pricing to encourage low-carbon innovation, but made no pledges to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. This regulatory capture perfectly demonstrates where divestment can help carbon legislation succeed. These companies promise that they will be responsible as soon as governments just give them an incentive to do so. All the while, they fund the political campaigns of those who vote down the exact carbon legislation they claim to want. Our society is so dependent on fossil fuels, not only because they give us electricity for our homes and gas for our cars, but also because these corporations have become a part of our government. Fossil fuel divestment, then, is a vote of no confidence in the companies that have such a massive influence over our energy policy. After Refuel Our Future, the undergraduate club at Johns Hopkins advocating for divestment, submitted a proposal to the Board of Trustees urging them to divest our endowment from fossil fuels, the Public Interest Investment Advisory Committee under the Board of Trustees, or PIAC, performed comprehensive research and identified 5 criteria for university divestment. The first, social harm of activity. Second, the likelihood of effect of action. Third, moral leadership. Fourth, fiduciary responsibilities to mission, endowment, and fiscal soundness. Fifth, representing the values of the university community. On the first count, the committee found the most polluting companies guilty as charged. On the second count, they acknowledged that while individual action is unlikely to result in change, participating in the collective action of divestment can move the needle forward. And reports from Bloomberg show that fossil fuel corporations like Shell are improving their renewable energy targets based upon dissatisfaction from investors. On the third count, PIAC argues that universities have in the past and must continue to be moral leaders on controversial issues. If Johns Hopkins can admit that climate change is a crisis, then a divestment action is highly consistent with the belief that the status quo of fossil fuel dependence must change. On the fourth count, there is substantial evidence to suggest that a fossil-free portfolio performs at least as well as a fossil-full one. And on the final count, a divestment action represents the values of the university in addressing climate change, consistent with our actions in reducing our carbon footprint and promoting research and education in sustainability. In 2014, Bloomberg found that over a 1-decade period, fossil-free indexes performed almost exactly the same as the S&P. Divestment is more than just a financial strategy. It is a new idea, and new ideas are a JHU specialty. PIAC spent many months doing brilliant research on the impacts of divestment. As we have already discussed, the fiduciary impact of a Hopkins divestment is small, but the work of PIAC has laid a foundation for the university to have a great role to play as a thought leader in sustainable investment. Of course, Hopkins must divest to show that it can be done, but we also have the ability to build an academic identity around sustainable investment and empower other institutions to make investment decisions that force our fossil fuel corporations to assume responsibility for the climate crisis and do their part in fixing it. A common misconception of divestment is that we will never be able to influence these corporations as shareholders. In fact, divestment is the ultimate expression of shareholder desire. Divestment empowers fossil fuel corporations to shift their business practices to become stewards of sustainability. If a fossil fuel corporation appropriately shifts these practices, there is no reason they cannot become an ideal candidate for sustainable investment. Milton Friedman said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable." A divestment action is by no means easy, and in 2017, not many institutions had done it. That's why our Board of Trustees decided not to divest from oil and gas in addition to coal. But in a crisis, seemingly impossible ideas become possible. By failing to divest from oil and gas, the Board of Trustees failed to perceive climate change as the type of crisis that requires an action as drastic as divestment. But if Hopkins follows through on full divestment, we will become one of the leaders in perceiving the crisis as a failure of our fossil fuel corporations to assume their portion of the blame, and we will take the seemingly impossible step to say no to fossil fuels. When others perceive the crisis too, it is up to our university, our faculty, our students, and our alumni to make sure that divestment is among the best ideas lying around to fight this crisis.